Hello, readers and listeners alike. I am Wandering Taff, and this is the Chronicle of Progress. Before we begin, I wish to apologize for my lack of updates recently. As I was researching the guilds, I came across a very deep and hidden vein of information. It took some researching before I could even make a statement here. Nevertheless, once again, I'm back at it, on track, and ready to go. So, let's begin, shall we? Entry 6. A Glance at the Guilds, Part 1. The Brewers, Bones, and Jewelers. It has come to my attention that the last entry may have displayed the guilds in a less than savory light. This was not my intention. In particular, I mentioned the Brewers Guild and some shady practices that they were involved in. While that particular entry is informative, it is not the norm for the guild's operations. Allow me to explain. Simply put, the guilds themselves are several organizations that use their organizing influence to alter the flow of goods and services in progress. The guilds are as follows: the Brewers Guild, the Bone Guild, the Jewelers Guild, the Blacksmith Guild, the Locksmith Guild, the Carpenters Guild, and the Alchemist Collective. This entry, as mentioned in the heading, will cover the Brewers Guild, the Bone Guild, and the Jewelers Guild, while the second part of this entry will contain information about the Blacksmith, Locksmith, Carpenter Guilds, and detailing the Alchemist Collective as well. To begin things, I'll talk about the Brewers Guild. The Brewers Guild is run by Kendra Naski. She is a very tough and built human woman who made a name for herself in her younger years as a mercenary, and her later years as she studied as a wizard. Her love of discovering secrets eventually fueled her desire in crafting specialty beer. She rose to power as a prominent brewer within Progress. After a series of bad batches brewed from some suspect wheat harvested during a particular year, many people fell ill after a festival held in the city. The wheat was suspected, inspected, and found to be a bad batch, namely a farmer named Dillyon Darry, who was experimenting with magically treated fertilizer added to his fields. A particular polluted wheat crop was sold to various brewers in the city and resulted in what's commonly referred to as the beer plague. Immediately following the beer plague, Noski organized a commission to found a guild, one that could standardize and approve beer, which has been brewed by individuals. The Brewers Guild stamp of approval is a common sight on just about any alcoholic beverage sold in Progress. Those without the stamp suffer the stigma of not being stamped. Algernon Beer Chasp's homemade brew that he sells in the Belching Bear is one of those unstamped beers. While stamped beers in the city are plentiful, the unstamped are not so few either. Which raises a larger question about the threats made to Algernon. Since there are so many unstamped beers in the city, why was the Belching Bear singled out and targeted? Was Algernon misinterpreting a request, or perhaps just confused? Or did the fact that Algernon's brew, being one of the first ever crafted in the city, is prestigious enough to risk threatening him and trying to bring his product into the guild? On this line of questioning, my sources run dry, and information eludes me. Well, at least until Naski comes to speak with me personally, that is. Kendra, consider this public question your chance to clear the air. I'll be awaiting your response. The last thing of note about the Brewers Guild is their signature brew, Red Dog. It is a mild and low alcohol content beer, cheaply brewed and cheaply sold, but it sports the guild seal of purity prominently and proudly across the bottle. The brew is fairly basic, but has become a staple in most taverns across Progress. The Bone Guild is Progress's funerary and graveyard guild. As the city grew and began sprawling outward, space became limited. And to put it callously, more people moving into the city meant more people would die there. So, almost out of necessity, several funerary specialists banded together to buy plots of land in various parts of the city to make room for the deceased. This group was led by an elf named Kale Vani, who became the guildmaster due to her ability to provide the majority of the capital to make these purchases. For the religious that don't make use of a funerary pyre to send off their deceased, their function was a necessity, and thus became quite the booming business. Burial space in Progress is limited and more expensive the closer to the city proper you go. Perhaps, and more interesting, and not often talked about, are the burial plots located on tops of buildings. These aerial graveyards are positioned on top of the few buildings in the city mains whose owners are either sympathetic with the graveyard space situation in Progress, or just looking to make a quick profit off of renting the space to the Bone Guild. Establishments which have an aerial grave above them agree to have a stairwell or some means of easy access to the roof from the streets below. The graves are often varied construction. More elaborate buildings have dirt landscape on the roofs. Others use more modest tombs for keeping up the remains. Others, however, are even more experimental, consisting of posing the body and encasing it in metals, turning it into a statue so that loved ones can actually touch and interact with the effigy of the deceased. The Jeweler Guild is a latecomer to the collection of guilds, run by a dwarf named Blevin Brownbeard. Blevin, unlike the previous two guild masters, rose to prominence through political clout rather than skills with gem and goldsmithing. When Progress was in its final stages of expansion, that is when the Jewelers Guild came to be. What started as a rivalry between several dwarven jewelry emporiums attempting to undercut and eventually destroy other businesses, Blevin saw many of his fellow dwarves literally caught up in violence against themselves. After no fewer than 8 fires, 5 severe beatings, 2 hand removals, and 1 death, Blevin called for a meeting. Between the clans of jewelers, he proposed that this violence come to a stop. Some disagreed with combining their efforts, but others agreed with him, seeing the infighting as damaging to business. Eventually, all the jeweler clans acquiesced, and the Jewelers Guild was formed. One jeweler clan stands out among the rest as noteworthy. The Silversteel clan are not dwarves, but rather a family of gnomes who have made it their focus to beautify the city. The city proper and scant buildings in the mains are noted for being decorated in glittering metals and embossed with artistic filigree. The Silversteels are primary artisans for all of this beautification seen amongst the proper, and would quite literally be the reason why the city as beautiful as it is impressive. As usual, at the bottom is an index linking you to my other entries that are mentioned in this particular one. If a topic piques your interest, feel free to cross-reference the information for yourself. I don't monetize for these entries, but if I did, I would tell you, before you cut a copper from me, send a silver to your favorite charity. If you're active in your church, tithe a bit more. Or if you're active in your community, spend a little more time volunteering. And lastly, I challenge us all to look the homeless in the eye when we pass by, and not just walk by with our eyes straight ahead. We all have hearts and souls and minds, and should be loved. If you enjoy what you hear, feel free to drop me a like. If you want to know more about Progress and its inhabitants, subscribe, and you'll get weekly updates. Or if you have a question, drop a line in the comments below. Lastly, and most importantly, if you don't like what you hear, give me a dislike and tell me why. I'm always looking to hone my craft, and how else will I know what works and what doesn't? Be waiting, for my next entry will come soon. But until then, good evening.